Oh, good morning, protege, or of course, good afternoon to my wonderful eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is my first direct instructional Zoomcast, A, with my brand new glasses. I'm still getting used to them. And B, we're in a new month. It's not October, kids. It's Rocktober. So this is Rocktober 1st, 2021, Friday. Thank gosh, everybody. I hear ya. All right. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody right now. And so again, I want to remind everybody at this point, you should have your ISN open. You're going to need, of course, a blue or black pen. You're going to need correctable tape, multiple colored highlighters. And remember, don't be highlighting as you're watching the Zoomcast and taking notes. Save your highlighting and even the cleaning up of your ISN with your correctable tape. Wait till you finish the entire Zoomcast. That's when you need to be highlighting and cleaning up. But you should still have your materials on your desk. So make sure that you go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make sure that you date your notes again for today. It is Friday, October 1st, 2021. And so what we're going to do is we're going to finish up this particular PowerPoint with a video clip on whom I consider to be the greatest and the most influential, maybe not the greatest, but the most influential, one of the most influential of the progressives. And that, of course, is Robert La Follette. So I taught you a little bit about Robert La Follette with my last Zoomcast. Again, a Wisconsin guy, former governor of Wisconsin, a future senator, one of the senators from Wisconsin, was a trailblazer, was a guy that was, again, talking about regulating the banks and the railroads as a governor of Wisconsin before anybody else was doing it. Tremendously influential, was big into conservation at a time when most governors never even thought or talked about it, and even tried to bring about political changes, things like recall, referendum, initiative. These are all things that Robert La Follette was very instrumental in promoting. So I'm going to now share a video clip with you guys on Robert La Follette. And as always, I'm going to share some guide questions with you. Now I'm going to go through these guide questions quickly. So that means, ergo, you need to make certain that, again, you're pausing the Zoomcast to allow you to get caught up. All right, so here we go. Guide question number one. I want you to describe for me Robert La Follette's speaking style. You're going to have an opportunity later on to analyze other famous people in history's speaking styles. He happens to be one of the first ones. In other words, was he dynamic? Was he flamboyant? Was he loud? Was he demonstrative, with his hands and such? Was he just very monotone? Was he interesting? Was he boring? That's what I want you to be focusing on. So elaborate. All right, moving on. Number two. The other thing I want you to look for in this speech by Robert La Follette is, what was the point he was trying to make? All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to begin the video clip. Again, it's a couple minutes long. It's not real lengthy. Here we go.
America is not made in the making. It has today to meet an impending crisis, menacing as any in the nation's history. It does not call a sound to arms, but it is nonetheless a call to patriotism and to higher ideals in citizenship. The patriotic citizenship of the country must take its stand and demand of wealth that it shall conduct its business lawfully, that it shall no longer furnish the most flagrant examples of persistent violation of statutes while invoking the protection of the courts, that it shall not destroy the equality of opportunity, the right to the pursuit of happiness guaranteed for the Constitution, that it shall keep its powerful hands off from legislative manipulation, that it shall not corrupt, but shall obey the government that guards and protects its rights. Mere passive citizenship is not enough. Men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from those who country. The call comes to every citizen. It is an unending struggle to make and keep government representative. Each one should count it a patriotic duty to build at least a part of his life into the life of his country, to do his share in the making of America according to the plan of the fathers.
Again, wow, progressivism, starring, of course, the late great senator, one of the senators from the great state of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette. I would argue maybe the most important and one of the most influential of all the progressives. So that speech was, again, recorded not too long before he passed away. I think it was in the mid-1920s, around 1924. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's continue on. So normally, I would have you guys skip a full page. You know what? Just skip a line or two. Let's finish up Robert La Follette now on the same page. And then what we'll do is we'll start a new page when we start our new PowerPoint. All right. So here's another example of something else that Robert La Follette, again, was instrumental in promoting. And that was, of course, what's called the 16th Amendment. So the 16th Amendment was something that gave the federal government more power in terms of taxation. And so what it did was it was a tax on income. So the money you make, whether you're working a part-time job at Portillo's eventually someday, or maybe at Walmart or Target, or you're working full-time, maybe as a school teacher. So every time you get your paycheck, some of that paycheck, some of the money is going to be sent to the federal government. And that's as a result of the 16th Amendment. And then again, Robert La Follette was very instrumental in pushing the envelope for this amendment to eventually be ratified 2/3 vote by the states in the United States of America, and a 2/3 vote on both houses of Congress, the Senate, the upper house, and the House of Representatives, the lower house. And then finally, another amendment that Robert La Follette was instrumental in really trying to push the envelope on, and it's called the 17th Amendment. So two constitutional amendments. Robert La Follette was instrumental in those amendments being ratified and then eventually added onto or amended and added onto the United States Constitution. So basically the 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of United States senators. You see, prior to this, and you should draw a line off to the side, you want to be adding more oral notes. So don't just be focusing on the notes in terms of the PowerPoint and then the bullet notes, but adding additional information. So prior to the 17th Amendment, senators were generally appointed by state legislatures, general assemblies. And the problem with that was, you vote for your presidents, you vote for your governors, you vote for your congresspersons representing you in the House of Reps, you vote for your mayors, but you don't directly vote for a senator. And this was something that was meant to put more power in the hands of the people, give them a greater say so. You might want to add that as a side oral note. Just pause the Zoomcast. That's what the beauty of these is, that you've got the opportunity that when you're adding additional information, pause it, write it down in your ISN, and then resume it. And a good example of this was, almost 20 years ago, there was this young guy by the name, maybe you heard of his name, Barack Obama, and he was running for a seat in the United States Senate. And one of the two seats, every state gets 2 senators, 2 seats, and one of the 2 seats in the great state of Illinois. He's going to be elected, I believe it was in 2004. And then in 2008, United States, one of the 2 U.S. senators from Illinois, Barack Obama, decided to run for the presidency. And I think you know the outcome of that story. Barack Obama made history. There you have it. So let's wrap up Robert La Follette, shall we? So Robert La Follette was important, and I'm going to give you guys 2 reasons why. And the sad thing with Robert La Follette is that most Americans, with exceptions of maybe people from Wisconsin, really don't know how influential Robert La Follette really was. So, number 1, a lot of the things he talked about, his reforms, like, for example, regulating the banks and regulating the railroads and trying to give more political say-so to the people. These were things that will also start to, again, emanate and transfer over to other states throughout the United States of America, who also will say, we need to take action. That's the progressives. It's thinking outside the box, not ignoring a problem, but tackling and addressing the problem. A good example of this would be that guy right there. His name was Woodrow Wilson. He was, again, a governor of the great state of New Jersey, who later on will become the last of our three progressive presidents of the United States. This guy, guys, by the name of Charles Evans Hughes, he was a former governor of the great state of New York, if my memory serves me correctly. And like Woodrow Wilson, both of these governors will promote, again, progressive reforms and changes, a kind of dovetailing off of what Robert La Follette had done when he was a former governor of the great state of Wisconsin. And then finally, number two, the other reason why Robert La Follette was important is because he had not only a profound influence on this guy right here, Dr. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, who becomes, again, governor of New Jersey, who later on becomes president of the United States of America, and of course, Charles Evans Hughes, who actually ran for the presidency in 1916. Ironically, he barely lost to Woodrow Wilson. A lot of people thought that Charles Evans Hughes won that election. He went to bed thinking he did. He did, as you'll find out later on. Charles Evans Hughes later on will be appointed to the United States Supreme Court. But let's get back to Robert La Follette. See how I'm weaving again different elements of the story? That makes the story, allows the story to make sense. It makes it complete. So Robert La Follette was a tremendous inspiration to, maybe some would argue, and I could see this, he might not be the greatest, maybe not the most influential, but I do know he's the most famous of all the progressives. And that, of course, with that wonderful smile of his, he was one of the most charismatic presidents we've ever had in American history. And one of my personal favorites to teach. I'm not necessarily going to give a bias and say he's the best president. I'm just saying for me, he's one of the most interesting presidents to talk about. And that, of course, is Theodore Roosevelt. So at this point, what I'm going to now do is I am going to go and we're going to start our next PowerPoint. So what I would like everybody to now do is I now want you to skip a full page and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make sure that you date your notes again for today. It's October 1st, 2021. It's Friday, thank gosh. So I want you to write down for me your topic heading, Theodore Roosevelt. You could say with the Dutch accent, Roosevelt or Roosevelt. Either one I will accept. Our 26th president of the United States of America, born in 1858, 3 years before the start of the Great American Civil War, died in 1919, right after World War I had ended, the Great War. So he was born before a war started and passed away after another one had ended. Also, progressive president, the first of our progressive presidents from 1901 through 1909. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, again, I always try to be as objective as possible. History teachers should never, ever, ever be offering their opinions. Our job is to present both sides of the story, present the facts, and let your students draw your own conclusions. So I'm not going to sit there and talk about how Theodore Roosevelt was the greatest president. All I'm simply saying is that for me personally, when you talk about guys that were really interesting and fun to talk about, Theodore Roosevelt has to be at the top of the food chain, if you will. He was truly a gregarious, outgoing, charismatic, as you're going to find out, a very influential president. All right, so here's what you're going to do. I want you to skip a full page, and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to come back to those notes that we just set up. Don't worry. So once again, you're going to date your notes for today. It's October 1st, 2021. And you're going to write down for me visual discovery, the lion tamer. So what you're going to now do is put your pens down. And I would like everybody to direct your attention up to my laptop screen. So this was a famous political cartoon that came out at the time of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. It was called The Lion Tamer. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to pause my Zoomcast for about 5 minutes. You're going to write for me a 2-paragraph reflection in your ISN. Paragraph number 1, the easier part. You're going to describe what you see. This is going to be a longer paragraph, but you're just describing all the details, like who is this guy? How is he dressed? What are all these animals? Well, how are they posturing? What do you notice there's writing on some of the animals? What does it say? Then in the second paragraph, this is going to be a shorter paragraph, but it's going to be more challenging. Remember, every political cartoon, there is a point that the political cartoonist is trying to make. So what was the point that this political cartoon was trying to make with regards to, again, Theodore Roosevelt as the lion tamer? Now, you're going to notice this political cartoon's a little bit fuzzy to see. So what you could do is temporarily, pause the Zoomcast. You can either go to your iPad. I would personally use your textbook. Go to chapter 18. The very first page of chapter 18 has a wonderful, marvelous, again, I'll even share it with you guys. You can see it. So this is right in your textbook. Here's your political cartoon, and you can see it much more clearly as compared to my Zoomcast. So I would just take your book out, study the political cartoon, take 5 minutes, write your 2-paragraph reflection. When you're done, resume the Zoomcast. I have, however, since you have the luxury of stopping the Zoomcast, I'm going to simply continue on. So what I want you to do is now go back to the previous page. So here's what I'm going to do. I want to share with you some interesting facts about Theodore Roosevelt. I do this with all the presidents. I think it's important you know a little something about their DNA and what makes them tick, because once you get to know them as a person, I find that when you really get into the nitty-gritty of their presidency, the things they did, their accomplishments and such, it's going to make a lot more sense as you tell the story. In this case, telling the story of Theodore Roosevelt. So number one, first interesting fact, write this down. Theodore Roosevelt has to be one of the most influential American presidents in history. There is no doubt in my mind. So I'm now going to share with you some of the most influential presidents of all time. Many of them in your top 5, top 10 greatest presidents in American history. But the one thing they all share in common has to do with being influential. So let me explain. So here are your presidents, write this down. So I would put Theodore Roosevelt in the same category as these very influential presidents: George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and a guy who goes by the initials FDR. We know him as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Does the name sound familiar? Yes, because this is a distant, much younger cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt, or Roosevelt, shares something in common with these other influential presidents. For example, number one, George Washington. Washington's influence, draw a line off to the side, he set precedents. Precedents means setting an example. He's the first president. So everything he did was setting an example, setting the tone for the other 45 presidents who will follow him. That's being influential. There was no president before him. There was no role model that George Washington could base his presidency off of. He basically interpreted the role of the presidency through his understanding of Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the executive branch. And again, the presidents, again, whether it's Joe Biden or going back to George Washington, they all, or John Adams, I should say, he's the second president, they all have a debt to George Washington because he set the tone. He established a template that all other future presidents will follow. Andrew Jackson set precedents in terms of two things. Number one, set precedents of really trying to get the common Joe involved in the process of making decisions. Again, it was Andrew Jackson who famously, again, loved the line, "To the victor belongs the spoils." William Marcy actually coined that phrase. You learned about Andy Jackson last year, example of the spoils system. So Andrew Jackson would reward his loyal followers with government jobs. He felt that they should be rewarded for their loyalty. He believed they would be more loyal to him. And this sets precedence. There's that word again, setting an example. You should add that as an oral side note. Abraham Lincoln. Again, the way he handled the American Civil War, very easily our country could have splintered and gone in two separate directions. But he set precedents by, again, keeping the country together. Yeah, I mean, he expanded the power of the presidency. You may have learned last year, he suspended habeas corpus. So sometimes, again, habeas corpus is Latin for basically you're entitled to certain rights and freedoms, like you're supposed to be told why you've been put in jail. And anybody who was with the Confederacy that was captured by the Union, they would often be put in jail and not have any rights and basically not even be told why they were put in jail. But again, the point I'm making is Lincoln is expanding the role and the powers of the presidency. And then another good example is Theodore Roosevelt's younger cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was tremendously influenced by his big cousin, Theodore. There was almost a 30-year gap between the two of them. Franklin Roosevelt dealt with the worst economic crisis in American history. It was called the Great Depression. And he came up with a plan. It was two parts. It was called the New Deal, the first New Deal and then the second New Deal. And what the New Deal did, first and second parts, was it greatly expanded the roles and responsibilities of the United States federal government. So these presidents, in addition to Theodore Roosevelt, what you see they have in common, they all set precedents, setting examples. And what they all did was they helped mold and shape and sometimes expand the role, expand the responsibility of being president. Make sure you add that as a side oral note. That's really, really important. That's why, again, just pause the Zoomcast. I'm going to continue on. This is a fun one. So an interesting fact about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the first bodybuilding president. A lot of people don't know that. What's exercise? Prior to, again, Theodore Roosevelt, from George Washington, our first president, through William McKinley, our 25th president, exercise was unheard of. What's exercise? It worked. But Theodore Roosevelt was different. He is going to set an example and set precedents. So as a kid, Theodore Roosevelt was very, very sickly. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop, that's a photograph of a very young Theodore Roosevelt, probably I would say about maybe 3-4 years young. So this would be right around the time of the height of the Civil War. And as a kid, Theodore Roosevelt had this medical condition called asthma. Asthma makes it's very hard for you to expand your lungs and breathe. And you have to understand, if anybody has asthma out there knows, you need that inhaler sometimes. Well, there were no inhalers in those days, no such thing. And so Theodore Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., basically said to his son, he used to call him TD. That was the nickname they gave to him. They would say, TD, there's not much we could do. You're going to have to just try to deal with this to the best of your ability. And so his father created a makeshift gym in the Roosevelt house. They were a very wealthy, affluent family in New York City. And so Theodore Roosevelt, from a very young age, started working out. And he worked out literally until the end of his life in 1919. It was a lesson, it was a legacy that his father had shared with him, and he carried with him well into adulthood. So you want to see what Theodore Roosevelt looked like when he was all grown up after he had been pumping the iron and such? So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that's Theodore Roosevelt. No, it's not. That's not Theodore Roosevelt. That's Arnold Schwarzenegger, the greatest, most famous of all the bodybuilders of the 20th century, who later on in the early 21st century became the governor, or the nickname was the Gouverneur of California, and this, that, and the other thing. Now, if you want to see what Theodore Roosevelt looked like all grown up, that's Theodore Roosevelt. He was a boxer in college. He attended Harvard University, one of the greatest, if not the greatest university in the United States of America, the very first university founded right outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt. I love the mutton chops against sideburns. That was very fashionable back in the 1880s, going back over 100 and almost 40 years ago. So we're going to skip over these facts. We're going to move on to another one. Please write this down. So Theodore Roosevelt, here's that word again, precedence, Precedence, precedence. Remember that word. Precedence means setting an example for others to follow. Theodore Roosevelt, one of the reasons why he's considered such an influential president is not only in terms of his expansion of the powers and duties and responsibilities of being president of the United States, but he was the first president. Meaning he was the first president to do something that set an example for other presidents to follow. So number one, please write this down. Theodore Roosevelt was first president to see the United States as the world police. Prior to Theodore Roosevelt, the previous 25 presidents maintained a policy of neutrality. We didn't get involved in Europe's affairs. And that actually goes back to the precedence of George Washington in 1797, when George Washington gave his farewell address, and he basically warned, again, the American people, don't get involved with political parties. He saw them divisive. Yeah, can you look at today in the 21st century? And number two, he warned Americans, stay out of Europe's affairs. And we did from basically 1797 all the way until to the time that Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States of America. So Theodore Roosevelt believed that the United States at this point should step out, and the United States should become more of a leader, as becoming kind of a cop of the world. This is a famous political cartoon, again, that came out when Roosevelt was president, and it says the big stick in the Caribbean Sea. And there was Theodore Roosevelt leading what's called the Great White Fleet. Again, Roosevelt's going to become much more actively involved in the affairs of Latin America, and is going to strongly suggest that the United States become much more actively involved in Europe's affairs, Asia's affairs as well. So Theodore Roosevelt had a saying, and the saying was, speak softly and carry a big stick. So what I want you to do is I want you to now pause the Zoomcast. You're going to draw a line off to the side. Take 2 minutes. You're going to generate your own oral note. I've given you some clues already. What did Theodore Roosevelt mean by speak softly and carry a big stick? And I'll give you a clue. Take a look at this political cartoon. Think about what I just shared with you. 1 to 3 minutes, brief oral notes. I'm going to continue on. Theodore Roosevelt was the first American president to promote conservation. This was unheard of. Now, the first national parks actually goes back to the presidency of one Ulysses S. Grant back in the early 1870s, mid-1870s, I should say. But Theodore Roosevelt was the first president that really pushed the envelope when it came to conservation, conserving our natural resources, our land, our water, our air that we breathe. This is a great photograph. I had the pleasure of visiting it many years ago. It's called Muir Woods. Muir Woods is located, if you ever go to San Francisco, California, I highly encourage you to visit someday with mom and dad. So if you're going over the Golden Gate Bridge, you're going to go about maybe 15 minutes or so north of the Golden Gate Bridge, and you'll see a sign for Muir Woods. I had the opportunity with Mrs. Bonk several years ago to walk through Muir Woods. It's stunning, these big, huge redwood trees. And what's also interesting about Muir Woods is that when you walk through it, there's quiet. You don't hear anything. You don't hear even animals moving about. There's a stillness that's almost eerie. And as a true story, Theodore Roosevelt saved these woods. A very famous conservationist by the name of John Muir and the civic leaders of San Francisco were worried that this whole area was going to be cut down, and basically it would take the lumber away and would be built up. And Theodore Roosevelt is going to basically issue an executive decree which set this land aside in perpetuity, set aside as a national park. So when you walk into Muir Woods, M-U-I-R, Woods, so for help your spelling, you'll see a sign right on a tree, basically Theodore Roosevelt issuing an executive order, setting this land aside that can never be built up, saving it for posterity. In addition, Theodore Roosevelt also was the very first American president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He won it in 1906 as he was beginning his second term as president of the United States of America. So I'm actually going to come back to this again. I'm just going to give you a quick overview. So he helped mediate and negotiate what's called the Treaty of Portsmouth. And he brought about the end of what was called the Russo-Japanese War that was fought between 1904 through 1905. It was a war that was fought between Russia and Japan. I'm going to come back to this later on. So Theodore Roosevelt wins a very prestigious award. It's called the Nobel Peace Prize, named after a very famous scientist, a Swedish scientist, Alfred Nobel. You can win it in different categories. You can win it in medicine. You can win it in science. You can win it in literature. And also you can win it in terms of promoting the cause of peace. Some future presidents who are going to win the Nobel Peace Prize: Woodrow Wilson, James Earl Carter, and of course, former President Barack Obama. In addition, Theodore Roosevelt, this ties in with that political cartoon, speak softly and carry a big stick. So he's the first American president to actively promote trying to get the United States to exercise and build up its naval power. Huge. So Theodore Roosevelt was a voracious reader. Theodore Roosevelt could read a book a day. Some people don't read a book a year. He could read a book a day. And he also had a photographic mind. Theodore Roosevelt could read a book and then 2 years later could recite a passage from the book verbatim. I can't do that. I don't have that brain. So Theodore Roosevelt read a book years earlier before he became president, written by this guy right here. His name is Alfred T. Mahan, Alfred Thayer Mahan. And Alfred Thayer Mahan had written a work that was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. It was published way back in 1890. So Mahan had basically said that when you look at the great civilizations, you go back to the ancient Greeks, you go back to the Romans, you go back to the ancient Chinese. What do all the great civilizations all have in common? And the answer is not just a strong army. That's not enough. You've got to have a strong navy. And so again, let's even go back to the Brits, the British Empire, go back 300, 400, 500 years ago. The Brits didn't necessarily have the biggest army in the world, but they had the biggest, most powerful navy in the world. And that's how they were able to build up their empire. And so Mahan said, that's the key if you really want to be a superpower. So Roosevelt, as president, said, you know, I read Mahan's book many years earlier and I agree. So what Theodore Roosevelt's going to do as president is he's going to create what's called the Great White Fleet. So the Great White Fleet was built, again, during Theodore Roosevelt's first and primarily second term as president. And so Theodore Roosevelt was going to send this Great White Fleet, this brand new state-of-the-art modern United States Navy, on a world tour, 2 years, from 1907 through 1909, at the end of his second term as president. And basically, the purpose behind it was meant to be a message. It was a message to Europe. It was a message to Asia. It was a message to the Brits, to the French, to the Germans. It was a message to the Japanese. It was a message basically saying the United States is moving away from its policy of neutrality, and we're going to get much more actively involved in world affairs. We are stepping out. We're going to become greater bearers, if you will, of being, again, the world police. So again, watch out, world. Here we come. And this all starts with Theodore Roosevelt. In addition, Theodore Roosevelt also is the very first American president to be referred to by his initials. All the other presidents always go by their first and middle name. And that, of course, is Theodore Roosevelt, TR. Theodore Roosevelt also is the youngest person, youngest man. We haven't had a female president yet. Let's hope in our lifetime, ladies, that day's coming. It will come. I really believe it'll be in my lifetime. We've already had an African-American president, Barack Obama. Again, we need to broaden our horizons. What about our first Asian-American president? What about our first female president? So let's hope that day's coming soon. Theodore Roosevelt's the first, or was the youngest president in American history. He became president at the age of 42. Holy shnikes, I'm 59. What am I doing wrong? No. But here's the point. Here's the question. Theodore Roosevelt, however, was the youngest person to become president. He was 42 years old when he became president in 1901, after then President William McKinley was assassinated. Now, in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, though, when he was elected in 1904, he's older than this guy. And the question is, so who was the youngest elected president? And that, of course, is this good-looking man. I have a photo of him in the back of my room. And that, of course, is John F. Kennedy. So while John F. Kennedy was a little bit older than Theodore Roosevelt when Roosevelt became president in 1901, however, when John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, was sworn in 1961, he was the youngest elected president. All right. So we're going to skip over this, and here's what I would like to share with you guys. Two other things. Point number one, if you would write this down. What, this is kind of a fun little interesting fact. Theodore Roosevelt had a toy named after him. Gee, I wonder what it was called. Duh. So if you have a teddy bear in your room, if you're hugging your teddy bear at night, you are hugging Theodore Roosevelt or a representation thereof. So yeah, pretty cool. A toy was named after Theodore Roosevelt. Wow. By the way, if you ever had a Baby Ruth candy bar, people have the misconception it was named after Babe Ruth. No, it's not. It was actually named after former President Grover Cleveland's daughter, Ruth, Babe Ruth. True story. So finally, I wanted to share this with you guys as I wrap up my direct instructional Zoomcast today. This is a really cool family photograph that was taken when Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States of America. So this is the Roosevelt family. It's a big one. So let me point a couple of key people out. So number one, this is his daughter, Alice. Now, Alice was born way back in 1884. That was his eldest daughter. In 1884, shortly after Alice Roosevelt was born, again, Roosevelt's first wife, Alice, passed away tragically. She died of Bright's disease. The same day, February 14th, 1884, so let's review, Theodore Roosevelt's wife, Alice Lee, passed away, and his mother, whom Theodore Roosevelt was very close to, she also passed away the same day, Valentine's Day, 1884. So Roosevelt is going to leave New York for a period of time. He's going to go out west to the Badlands of the Dakotas, spends time working as a cowboy, and then returns back. And when he returns back, he ends up getting remarried a second time. And he marries this gal. This is a childhood friend of his. Her name was Edith. So this is Edith Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt, Theodore, with Edith, had several children together. So Alice was from his first marriage right there. She was born in 1884. Then this gentleman right there, oh yeah, he definitely looks like a Roosevelt. That, of course, is Theodore Jr. Theodore was born in 1887. By the way, Theodore Jr. fought in both World War I and World War II, fought at the Battle of the Bulge. Then the next person we want to talk about would be Kermit. This is Kermit right here. Kermit was born in 1889. Then the next person we want to talk about, this is his daughter, Ethel, his second daughter. So Ethel was born in 1891. So there's a bigger age gap between Ethel and, of course, Alice. Then the next one I want to talk about, this would be Archie right here. And Archie was born in 1894. And then this is the baby of the family, and that is Quentin Roosevelt. Can you tell that this was Daddy's little boy, the way he's posing and leaning his head on his father's shoulder? So Quentin was born in 1897. So there was a big age gap between Quentin and, of course, his elder sister right here, Alice, his half-sister. And this is just a very sad story. So it was a beautiful family. The Roosevelts were very much into serving the American people. And Quentin, like his brothers, like Theodore Jr., served in the military. And Quentin joined the United States Air Force, fought in World War I. And tragically, in 1918, the baby of the family, Quentin, was shot down while flying over the Western Front. Theodore Roosevelt never, ever truly got over the heartbreak of losing his son being killed in action during World War I. And Theodore Roosevelt died in 1919. I can't prove it, but you wonder, did Theodore Roosevelt, actually die from a broken heart as a result of the baby's passing, the baby of the family, who was a young man at that point? But just a beautiful picture of a wonderful, powerful family that really had a huge impact on American history. So there you have it, sports fans. That is a nice, quick little synopsis of some interesting facts about the first of our progressive presidents. I'm going to come back to Theodore Roosevelt with my final Zoomcast, and I'm going to really get into his presidency and why he's considered the first of the great three progressive presidents. So at this point, I need everybody to take out your correctable tape. I want you to go and clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. There's no crossing out. There's no tracing over letters. There's no doodling or drawing. This isn't an art class. This is a history class. Your ISN is a portfolio of your absolute best work and effort. In addition, remember, you need two different colored highlighters, tip and a tip. Focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, the places, and the things. Don't be highlighting entire sentences. That's coloring. Highlighting is a reading strategy that promotes greater understanding and mastery, which should help you then in getting ready for the assessment. In addition, remember, everybody's required to review your ISN 10 to 15 minutes. Don't be packing up. Go back and review your notes from today. Remember, if you're going to get in shape, you can't just get on the treadmill once a week for 2 hours. You got to get on the treadmill every day, 5-6 days a week for 15, 20, 25 minutes. That's how you get in shape. That's how you really develop mastery. And remember, you have an opportunity, hand your mom or dad, or maybe an older brother or sister, or maybe an aunt or an uncle that had me decades earlier. Hand them your ISN and you teach them the information about Robert La Follette and his importance. Talk about that video and Robert La Follette's speaking style and what was the point of his speech. Talk about some of the interesting facts about Theodore Roosevelt, one of the most influential presidents in American history. And ladies and gentlemen, as I always like to say as I wrap up one of my Zoomcasts, you know, the story may have ended today, but you know the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Thank you so much. Peace out, everybody. And as always, be well.